Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. Thanks for tuning in today. This is an educational channel where you will get hooked up with information that is powerful, that will make you reassess things that are obscure, but things that people maybe work their whole life on, trying to figure it out. Grand unified theories, earth-shattering discoveries, magnum opuses, tour de forces. And in this case, we're doing another Bible decode, number 223 from the New Testament. And obviously the Bible is not in that category, but the interpretations, we have been looking at the Roman origins interpretation for the New Testament, that the Romans had a lot more to do with the creation of Christianity. We know the Romans, propagated Christianity, especially, starting with Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century, and even to a limited degree before that, all the bishops of Rome. But the Romans were, at least according to this theory, very involved in the origins of Christianity. Many authors have talked about them, the Romans having written the New Testament in whole or in part. And we've gone over a lot of that work. Joseph Atwill's Caesar's Messiah, a lot of work by Roman Piso and Abelard Reichland, Henry Davis, and Cliff Carrington, and Michael Menescot's, his new book called Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. And the Flavians have to do with the dynasty of Caesars, who were mostly involved in all of this. And that is Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian, from 69 until 96 AD. And the theory goes that they wrote the New Testament as a psychological operation just after defeating the Jews in war, the War of the Jews, 66 to 73 AD. And they knew the Jews were very resilient, especially when it came to fighting wars. And the Romans had been plagued by the Jews for over 100 years, ever since they took over in Judea in 63 BC. And so they tried to go into their bag of psychological operations in order to mellow out or prune or make less aggressive or domesticate the Jews, tame the Jews. And they did that recognizing that the Jews were waiting for a Messiah who would help them rise up and defeat Rome. Instead, the Romans wrote the New Testament and presented a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and one who would render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and walk an extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pack and all of that. And moreover, the real propagator of Christianity, Paul, was even more pro-Roman, deferential to the Romans, and anti-Jew than Jesus was. And that's just basically the motive, or at least one of the motives for the Romans. You could go look at any of my last 200 videos where I talk about the method of operations, the MO that the Romans had, and the means and the opportunity the Romans had, but more is the concrete evidence from the texts, from the scriptures, so-called, that were really written by the Romans, and the history book called War of the Jews by Josephus, who was an agent of the Romans and really a family member of the Roman Caesars by adoption. And when you look at those two books side by side and know what you're looking for, the parallels will jump off the page. And there literally are several hundred of them. Michael Menescot's found 250 of them just in the book of Luke. And they are of various levels of detail and intricacy, various levels of mocking and ridiculing attitude, and mean-spiritedness, accusatory, and pornographic, but also filled with nuggets of Greek and Roman stoicism, cynicism, Platonism, and a good deal of Egyptian philosophy, as well as some mythology from all around the Near East, and anything else that the Romans could get their hands on. And keep in mind, the Romans were also friendly with the Herods, and the Herods had a lot of knowledge and information about the Old Testament. So it was also hooked up with the Old Testament. You have to understand that for the Romans, the Bible was a limited hangout, meaning that they had to put in some good stuff so that you would believe the diversionary stuff, the stuff that's going to get you to be a docile pacifist. That's what they wanted. The Romans wanted you to be a good citizen. That way you're low maintenance. If you're a hardworking, law-abiding citizen, that's perfect for the Romans. They want to be able to easily govern you because they have literally hundreds of different tribes and nations under their umbrella at this point, and it was very difficult to keep all of them governed. But of all the nations that they had, the Jews were the most difficult to deal with. And that's why they created the Gospels. There's a lot of codes and jokes and inside baseball and themes of the different levels of parallels, including the 3-year ministry of Jesus being nothing but a replica of the 3-year military campaign of Titus as described in Josephus's War of the Jews. And Menescot's actually took the 250 parallels he found in the book of Luke and charted them on a graph with the book of Luke on the vertical axis and War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. It makes 5 near-perfect letters in Latin, the language of the Roman Caesars, and also the more obvious evidence is that, so what that means is that the Romans literally signed their name to the book of Luke for future reference, for future discovery. And, more bluntly, both Josephus and the Gospels are written in Greek, which is the other language of the Romans. Most of the Roman royals were bilingual in Greek and Roman, and very few Jews in Palestine were fluent in Roman. I mean, in what I said, Greek and Roman, Greek and Latin. Very few in Latin, but even in Greek. which was much more of a cosmopolitan language. Very few in Judea were literate at all, much less literate in Greek. They spoke and wrote in Aramaic, if they wrote at all. But today we're looking at a book that is called Operation Messiah. And this book scratches the surface of the Roman origins hypothesis, but does not quite reach it. They can recognize the pro-Roman nature of Paul and the anti-Jewish nature of Paul, but they don't see that same, those same impulses in Jesus and in the Gospels. And so they stop short of the Roman origins hypothesis and just try to argue that Paul is a secret agent of the Romans, that Paul was a spy. And he was there to try to infiltrate after his conversion or calling on the road to Damascus, and he becomes Paul. Then he eventually tries to infiltrate the Nazarene movement, and probably some others as well that were Jews, and they were observant Jews, but they also had Peter and James were, James, the brother of Jesus, was, witnesses of Jesus before he was crucified. Paul just comes out and says, I met Jesus, not in the flesh, but he in many places actually kind of demeans the Nazarenes and contends that his contact with Jesus is more legitimate than theirs, who they actually knew him in the flesh and so on. But anyway, they kick around all those ideas in this book. We are about to finish chapter 6, and let's just see what happens. Since we have no primary sources for the view of the Jerusalem community, its attitude remains uncertain. Nazarenes very probably had an ambivalent view of Paul. The people who had been converted by him were not observant Jews. To let such an example be publicized might even be dangerous, since his converts could prompt others to transgress the law. On the other hand, since Christ was being preached, perhaps they thought Paul's message was better than nothing. Unity may have taken precedence over questionable practice. Perhaps centers were being founded where work could be continued and later corrected by delegates from Jerusalem. Acts 15 and Galatians 2 report that the debate over circumcision was resolved. The council allegedly came to a consensus about what was to be required of non-Jewish members and sent a letter to Antioch to outline its thoughts on the matter. According to Acts, the letter was delivered by Paul and Barnabas, accompanied by Judas and Silas, about whom we know nothing. We are told the agreement was that Paul had the assent of the Jerusalem community for his mission to the Gentiles without circumcision. But in reality, the Nazarenes probably never assented. Paul's letters, which he wrote later, and in which he continues to argue his point in this regard, testify to a continuing debate. Paul would continue to argue that circumcision should not be required of non-Jewish members, but to be a Nazarene meant to be a Jew. And to be a Jew, you had to be circumcised. Paul allegedly sealed the agreement with a gift of money from the Antioch community. And he also pledged to take up a collection for the Jerusalem community. After their return to Antioch, Barnabas remained in the community, but Paul had to become itinerant again. His perversion of Judaism had alienated him from two communities, and he went back to causing strife among Jewish Messianists everywhere he went. Yeah, this is interesting because Paul, when you do look at what he was doing, I mean, it's like he was, I call him like a human false flag operation. You know, every place he goes, he creates a little bit of a riot, and the Romans have to save him from the Jews, and so you wonder, why are the Romans so intent on saving this guy if he's not an agent of them? But then when you look at the Roman origins hypothesis, and you can instead posit that the entire thing is fiction, and that it's a psychological operation, lock, stock, and barrel, not just the part about Paul, but the entire New Testament. And so then you don't have to quibble about, you know, whether this actually happened or not. This is a writer's fiction, really not even fiction, but propaganda for psychological purposes. Anyway, that was the end of chapter 6. And now we're about to do chapter 7, which is called Paul's Independent Missions. We cannot discuss each of Paul's journeys to the East in detail, nor is there a great deal of agreement on his itinerary. As always, Acts does not agree with the letters on the details, and an accurate chronology cannot be established for either version, although this has not stopped some scholars from trying. In consequence, we will simply discuss his travels in very general terms to see if we can distinguish any patterns in his behavior that fit our theory about his political work and identify his friends and enemies. So this section is called The Second Missionary Journey, Syria, Cilicia, Philippi, Thessalonica, Athens, Corinth. They say approximately the 50s AD. It is inferred from Philippians 4:10 through 16, 2 Corinthians 11:8-9, and Acts 18:5 that a group of people at Philippi became the new major support of Paul's missionary activities in the regions around the Aegean Sea. During a visit to Philippi, which was a Roman colony and the leading city of that district in Macedonia, a crowd brought Paul and his new companion Silas to the local authorities. The enemies that Paul and Silas had already made in such a short time were allegedly upset because the two men were disturbing commerce in the city. As Acts 16:16 tells it, even though the passage has worked to support the portrayal of Paul as a man who suffered for Christ, it was economic interests that led to accusations against Paul, not his religious activities. Rowdiness in the streets and the intensity of the tumult had caused the magistrates to have Paul and Silas beaten with rods and thrown into jail. Their treatment was that usually meted out to vagrants or those with lower class status. Miraculously, the two were freed that night by an earthquake, so-called, that threw the prison doors open and made everyone's chains come loose. That's in Acts 16:26. That's a pretty big red flag right there. An earthquake that threw the prison doors open and made everyone's chains come loose. Now, so, your average reader there is going to go with, that's an act of God. God did that. How else could it have been done? That there's an earthquake, and that the effect of the earthquake is that everybody's chains, all the prisoners' chains came loose. Or you can just go with the Romans' origins hypothesis and recognize that the entire thing is fiction. So you no longer need to use a supernatural explanation. You can use a perfectly rational and reasonable explanation, albeit conspiratorial. These conflicts may have been more dangerous for Paul than Acts makes them appear. Anti-Roman activity by the Nazarenes and possible Roman retaliation would never be good for the peace and commerce of the city. When the Romans lashed out for security reasons, they did not distinguish between activist and non-activist Jews, so Paul's provocative actions would have appeared dangerous to all Jews, not just to him. Paul's alleged prison experience in Philippi was the worst of any described by Acts. After a vicious beating, or so Acts claims, Paul and Silas were confined in stocks in the inner cell of the prison. Such confinement was probably in near or complete darkness. The usual security precaution of denying light to the prisons at night was certainly employed, as the jailer's cry for lamps or torches confirms. The other prisoners may have been able to hear Paul and Silas singing and praying. Some have suggested that the description of what went on in the prison is pure theater, invented by the author of Acts. The events all come under what one author calls the many rational impossibilities of the text. We do not know enough about the confinement arrangements to make such judgments, nor does the story make much sense. Who or what, apart from geological circumstances, could have caused this release, and why? If it was an earthquake that threw open the prison doors, one wonders why there was no attempt at recapturing Paul. Acts tells us that after the earthquake, the authorities wanted to let Paul go, but not why. Acts tells us that after the earthquake, the authorities wanted to let Paul go, but not why they wanted to let Paul go. Acts does state that upon his release, the authorities were horrified to hear that Paul was a Roman citizen. They tried to placate the prisoners before they left town. That's in Acts 16:39. This could be a clue that by then the authorities had been told that these prisoners were operating under a Roman cloak of protection as Roman citizens or agents. The chain of events seems to support this possibility. After all, had Paul really been a Roman citizen, he would have informed the authorities of his citizenship right away in order to prevent imprisonment or mistreatment. If he was an undercover agent, however, it would have been prudent for him to keep that information to himself, as long as he was in public. He would only have been able to give that information later on to certain individuals who knew that it was important to safeguard his life, keep his true identity from the public, and thereby enable him to continue his mission. Paul and Silas convert the jailer in Acts 16:34 and go home with him. Why would the Philippian jailer transfer known criminals to his own home? He secures the rest of the prisoners, but he does not secure Paul. There are no other prison officials to keep him from becoming friends with the prisoner. This is another example of how miracles seem to happen to everyone who comes into contact with Paul, and how more divine protection is ascribed to Paul than even to Jesus himself. Can this protection be Roman? That's interesting, that question. Can this protection be Roman? Or perhaps the entire thing is Roman. And, the divine acts that are following Paul around are as a result of the entire thing being fiction and really propaganda. Okay, this section is on Thessalonica. Upon their sudden and unexpected release, Paul and Silas sailed to Thessalonica, which was home to a small Jewish community. As was his custom, Paul went to the synagogue over 3 different Sabbaths to argue with them. Acts tells us a few Jews believed Paul, as did several Gentiles elsewhere in the town. But the majority of Jews were incensed. They went to the Roman authorities and produced one of the arguments used earlier against Jesus. This man is an affront to Caesar, for he claims that there is another king. In other words, Paul is being accused of being a political agitator just like Jesus, a threat to Roman rule. Paul is accused of challenging the officially recognized and established Jewish communities and sedition against Caesar. If the Roman authorities thought that Paul was declaring a different ruler over the sovereign head of the empire, he would have been crucified instantly. The Jews, however, were exempt from the usual forms of emperor worship. Right, because the Jews had, back in about 40 AD, Emperor Caligula attempted to put a statue of himself into the Jewish temple, which obviously goes against their stricture against graven images, and the Jews were ready to go to war against this. And eventually Caligula relented. And so even though the Romans continued to put their emperor statues in other of their colonies, religious places, they weren't able to do that for the Jews. So that's what he's saying. The Jews, however, were exempt from the usual forms of emperor worship because they just couldn't make the Jews do it. They would have to kill the Jews to get them to do it. So, as long as the followers of Jesus were considered by the Roman authorities to be part of official Judaism, they were exempt from emperor worship. The problem of the irreconcilability of Jesus worship and worship of the emperor would not become politically volatile until Christianity made a total break from Judaism. Acts adds that Paul's speech about Jesus allegedly made him very popular, which in turn made the Jews jealous. The Jews rounded up some bad characters from the marketplace and started a riot in the city. That's in Acts 17:5. A mob was summoned to make an attack on the Christ believers. The house of Jason was attacked, but Paul and Silas were not there. As always, the author of Acts makes it seem as if the Jews were causing unrest, but not Paul. Acts is an apologetic effort to placate the Romans, but it does not altogether conceal the truth. It tries to claim that the Christian message was misrepresented by its Jewish traducers. It was the Jews in the Greek cities, if they did so, who attacked Paul and his colleagues on their missionary journeys. They believed them to be zealot agitators as they were proclaiming the Messiah, and in self-protection, the Jews took action against them. The local Jews at Thessalonica informed the magistrates that these subverters of the empire have not reached here, and they are actively opposed to imperial decrees saying there is another emperor, one Jesus. The Jewish leadership was charging Paul with causing disarray and commotion in their communities all over the world. Paul is accused, in effect, of being a Nazarene. Paul and Silas leave the city, and Jason is dismissed from court with a bond to pay Paul's encounter with the authorities in Macedonia. Jason is dismissed from court with a bond to pay. Paul's encounter with the authorities in Macedonia had ended with his ignominious banishment from Thessalonica and in lasting difficulties for the community he had founded there. The next stop was the synagogue in Berea, possibly. It's all blurry. I think it's Berea, which I thought was in Palestine. But anyway, the synagogue in Berea, also home to a small Jewish community there. Here, Acts tells us Paul was immensely popular once again. The Jews from Thessalonica, still determined to stop him, came to Berea and started riots because of Paul's presence. Paul was rescued by the brothers. Inevitably, Paul made a timely escape and escorted